with Lydia and have like an in-depth look at your recent show Barça at Marseille in Triangle in Marseille, sorry, that was also in Kunsthalle Basel a couple of months ago, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think Lydia has prepared some images too.
Yeah. Um, yeah,
Oh.
Lydia wanted to just like focus on this exhibition, Barça, because just like do the whole half an hour talking about just this one project. And I think it makes a lot of sense with her work, and I think we can talk more about that later.
Yeah.
Like giving context to the works that are presented in art spaces is very important, and I think also especially in like the context of conversations too. And yeah, so hopefully we can like really get into the details of all of the objects that Lydia is presenting in this show. And I think we could start for those people who aren't familiar with the project or haven't been able to be there.
Quick. Yeah, we're speaking about the exhibition which is currently on in Marseille, which is a co-production between Kunsthalle Basel and Triangle France. And it was a project actually that I produced most of whilst I was on a residency in Marseille while I was locked out of Algeria. So I'd been living in Algeria since 2018. And it was kind of this moment in my life and my work where I felt that, there was a natural progression towards spending more time back in this place that I guess I had quite a complicated relationship with. So like being born there, moving out at the age of 10, and then kind of spending the next few years of my life going back and forth and being very much anchored in between these two very different cultures, very different spaces, and kind of trying to negotiate a relationship around, the concept of home, I guess, which became a lot more important in my thinking, especially in the recent years. So in 2018, I decided to move back, and it was the first time that I'd kind of lived there as an adult, kind of outside of the context of my parents, which was in like a different city. And I think that was a really important kind of moment to be able to understand like what was or where did this longing to go back originate from. I think it's really difficult to distinguish, why you feel like a certain place, you need to put your body in a certain place or not. And I think this was really a kind of, I needed to practice that and to kind of define it somehow. So I moved back and I started looking for apartments. I wasn't really sure like how long I'd be staying. And I ended up looking at 34 different apartments. And no one would rent to me because I was an unmarried woman. So that kind of, I'd go and see places and they'd be like, where's your husband? Or like, where's your family? And actually, so the place I ended up moving into was the first place that would rent to me as like a single person. And it was interesting because like, as soon as I moved in like a week after I'd seen it. And the family that had inherited this house, this apartment, basically left like the majority of their dead aunt's stuff in it. So it was like fully furnished, but it was like kind of furnished to the point of like there being like photographs in the drawers, like half-used candles, kind of pictures of this person and her previous and like her life, and bed sheets. Her passport was still in there. It was kind of like the extent of furnishing was like almost kind of. It felt like she still lived there somehow. And so, I moved in and I began to kind of use everything that I found, like, her plates, her bed sheets, her everything. And so I kind of like yeah, I don't know. I'm not really describing the project.
No, sorry. Are the images ready? I think I have a problem with my microphone as well, so sorry for this.
The images are gonna take a little bit. They're like like downloading everything. But maybe we can give a bit of context as to like.
Just a
What?
second. Can everyone hear me? Yes?
Yeah.
Okay, so it's only me with this strange noise inside. Okay, perfect. I just wanted to check that.
Yeah, so we were like, as we said at the beginning, like the idea for this series of talks was like trying to debate and like question this idea of legibility and thinking of illegibility and opacity, and we wanted to look at how that related to certain like formal languages from the 20th century or certain strategies from like the first avant-garde, second avant-garde, and we really were interested by the kind of work that Lydia does with objects, and we found like certain parallels between her work and like how the strategy of the ready-made was formulated in the early 20th century, like this idea of taking unintervened everyday object and decontextualizing it or dislocating it and putting it in art space, and how that immediately like raised a series of questions about like this essential question of what is this doing here, and of course that like back then was like oriented towards like questioning the conventions of art in a different moment. And like we're not trying to imply like any connection with Lydia's work. Obviously, she's working in a very different direction. But we thought that it was interesting, like how decontextualizing something serves to sort of like pose these questions, or sort of like make the context of those objects like very explicit or very present or very heavy in the space. And we wanted maybe to ask you if you could tell us a bit about like how do you like what do you feel maybe like dislocating certain objects or decontextualizing them does in your work, if you can tell us more about that gesture also in relation to like the implications of, because you work a lot obviously with not only like what is this object doing here, but like how it got there, like the process of like bringing something into the art space is like very important. And how it also relates to the movement of people, and like, yeah, if you could tell us a bit more about like this idea of decontextualizing or dislocating things.
I think it's interesting because if I look back on the work that I've made, it's often kind of does really encounter such, this kind of active dislocation is such a kind of fundamental part of the work, and the work really, the process of movement is really necessary for the work to happen. But I think like in a lot of cases, like the journey is the work. It's not so much about the objects that I'm trying to dislocate, it's about the process that I put the objects through, or the materials. And I think the kind of energy that is created when something is in motion, I think that's the kind of I don't know if that's what you mean by the dislocation, but I think also these objects need a certain amount of distance to be legible in a different context. Like I often get asked, if the work was shown in Algeria, for example, what would that look like, or how would that feel? But it's not really about like where the objects come from per se. I think it's more about the tension that is created. And for example, like I think this duality and this kind of disillusion of space, when something is like anchored in between, I think like it's necessary for that kind of tension to be drawn out through the act of dislocation, if that makes any sense.
this idea of being in I don't know if you heard that, like about this idea of being in between in relation to the title of the exhibition of Bartzach, and like the meanings of this word in terms of like threshold and in betweenness.
I came across this word, barzakh, which is, it's the Arabic term. There's many translations for the word, but it's usually used in relation to this kind of in-between space between life and death. But it's not so much a kind of space of purgatory. It's more like somewhere that you can rest before you move on. And I thought that was a really important kind of way to describe the work that we're speaking about, the show Barzakh, as it was so much about the attempt to locate this idea of home within a space that and an environment which isn't yours, that you kind of like almost adopt to try and understand what that concept of home might mean. You know, I think like when you move into spaces and when you live in and amongst the objects that belong to other people, I think you know, there's no kind of clear designation of like how you can then encounter that space. You know, everything kind of bleeds, and I think yeah, so it was kind of like there was a kind of feeling of not quite being there, or a kind of like phantomness and an absence that was so kind of embedded in that entire experience.
Yeah,
And it's really hard to like talk about this show that we can't actually see.
Yeah,
I know.
I've just asked, and the images are gonna be ready in 4 minutes,
Okay.
apparently. So
Okay.
we can also just, I don't know.
Is there something that maybe we could talk about, like requires less images, or
We can just describe the images. So basically,
yeah,
so basically, the show that we're trying to talk about was involved the movement of, I basically shipped the entire apartment from Algiers to Basel, and that involved like every single piece of furniture, every item in the house, including the front doors that we had cut out of the building. And the apartment was reinstalled first in Kunsthalle Basel, without any walls. So you kind of basically moved through the space and through the rooms, but without, you know, just kind of bleeding through. And
and it was like the furniture is sort of like in the same place as like recreating the movement around the apartment and everything. Yeah.
so the furniture, I basically laid it out as it was in the apartment in my mind. Of course, there were like moments where this like warped and like shifted slightly because it was all done by memory. But you know, it was something that happened. Like as soon as I got to Basel and as soon as everything arrived, it was just like instinctive. I was like, I have to return everything to how I remember it being. And I think that was like, I mean, yeah, like I guess like the initial shock of like encountering all of these objects and then like not being able to recognize them because they were like in boxes and had been like handled and moved across such a long distance. And then like, you know, I almost felt like I had to at least make them feel like they could understand where they were by being roughly in the same place or like holding the same objects. And there was this really intense moment of like abjection, like completely could not recognize anything. Even like things that were mine, I was kind of like looking at them and like not being able to understand. And yeah, so I think this kind of like the way that I negotiated that was to like as quickly as possible make it look like the apartment again. Yeah, and
Maybe we could like the other day when we were talking about this little bit, like, and I think that this was like very important in the texts that you sent us, like this idea of like intimacy in relation to these objects. Like you were saying before, that all this has to do with like finding this idea of a home, like finding in this apartment like a certain like feeling of like being comfortable, like, and like having your space of intimacy there, and like this that you were saying right now, like this feeling of objection when you open these boxes. Maybe you could tell us a bit more about like about how like your body is related to these objects also, like, because I think that's very important also, like what these objects do to you. You were saying the other day, like when you went into this apartment, like you started using the bed sheets that were right there, like this like extreme closeness of these objects to your own body. And also I think like the body of like people is very involved there, like you have like this surveillance system which is made with lasers, if I'm not wrong.
Yeah.
And like the body is like constantly interfering with those, and like sort of like being like implied in the whole space. And then maybe you wanted to say something about like this like closeness between the objects and the body, and like this intimacy, and like what those objects like maybe do to you, to your habits in this apartment.
I think, I mean, when, you know, the audience are basically allowed to touch everything and go through everything, but we don't make it explicit, like you can or cannot, because there has to be a moment where like people have the agency to decide what they do inside someone else's intimate space. And I think
like nobody was telling people if they could touch or not touch.
no.
Okay.
So that was, you know, but I think oftentimes if someone saw someone else like going through the cupboards or like opening things, then everyone else would follow suit. And I think, yeah, I mean, it really kind of, I remember like the day that it opened, kind of like watching strangers like going through everything.
I think they're ready now.
Oh, amazing.
Cool.
Gracias.
Okay,
Okay,
so we're
sorry
just-
for that, but now I think we can
quickly-
retake
there we go.
with the images.
So this is what the exhibition looks like.
Yeah, this is gonna
This
be
is
easier
Basel,
now.
right?
Yeah.
Yeah, this was in Basel.
Okay, so
Um,
this is the whole apartment, right? With all of the objects, just to recap a little bit, in case someone was losing.
I'm just gonna like be kind of flitting back and forth. Yeah, I think, you know, like the audience had so much agency in encountering the work, whether they decided to like open cupboards or sit and read like all of my diaries or notebooks or like spray my perfume or whatever. And I think, you know, maybe I think a really important practice in that was to kind of like be okay with like that level of transparency in a way. I think, you know, even like not knowing what I'd actually left there, because I left this apartment in Algiers so quickly. It was like almost a year now, actually. And I just took one suitcase when I left. So I don't actually know like how much, like what was actually there. And then to kind of just like lay it back out and leave everything where it was and like allow people to touch everything. No, I think it was a very important practice, and you know, like
I really like, or I
Yeah.
really feel that there's like this sort of tension between. Let me go back to this concept that's probably going to be recurring throughout the talks, between certain opacity, I'd say, to the objects, but also a lot of eloquence in them, right? Because people felt this need to open them, to touch them sometimes, and I think that's very, very interesting. And maybe it's just like an answer to this very simple question of what is this doing here, which is like a very avant-garde question, again related to ready-made. Just retaking your comment, Alberto. But I'm really fascinated that people really engaged with it and touched the stuff of the.
I think it's like because everything in this show relates directly to a body, and everything like is directly linked to another human being. And I think like this like urgency to touch and to go through and to really search for that body is like, you know, that's kind of where the intimacy is. It's like desperately trying to seek like where that person is, you know, but only kind of encountering their absence through everything that they've left behind.
Also, we really liked when we read this text that Carlos Kong wrote about your show, and he was talking about this clinging of colonial past like to bodies, and like trying to like finding that also like in the objects in this space, and this idea of like the objects like carrying all this weight with them, and that being like really really explicit in the show. And maybe I think you could tell us a bit more about this door, which I think is like super,
Yeah.
like a very important bit, like this closed door that has like two layers to it, and how that sort of like brings all this history of like different times of what that house went through.
So the apartment itself was one of the first buildings to be built by the French in 1901, and that colonial project was basically this kind of prioritization of the line of vision when you enter Algiers from the sea. So it was important that Algiers looked like France when people would approach by boat. And the street that I was living on was the second street from the port. And so, the way that it happened was that it was a Haussmannian blueprint, which was lifted and basically netted onto Algiers, the city. And all of these buildings started being constructed, but it wasn't taken into consideration, like the kind of geological differences that would mean that you should alter the blueprints of a building. So, Algiers is a very mountainous region. And so when these apartment blocks started going up, there's so many areas where you kind of notice like these like buildings kind of warping slightly, or like becoming very thin at points or triangulating. And this is to do with like, when the land inclines, it kind of forces the walls upwards. So it kind of creates this constriction. And, that point of like, the point of interrogation is through the body. I was working with this architect who remade all of the plans of the apartment. And she was saying that like in the bathroom, it happened a little bit. Like it wasn't that extreme in my building, but in the bathroom. And then I was like, okay, that's why like when I went to the toilet, I couldn't like put my legs straight. I had to put my legs like that way. So it's, these very kind of like subtle, but like very violent like processes of the way that like colonial architecture was kind of imposed on the city. So, this is kind of, this piece, the door, for me was extremely important to kind of like have a materialization of this space, like to have the original brickworks from this Haussmannian building from 1901, which had the original like wooden door, which you can see on the back. And then, fast forward to the 90s, during the Black Decade, which was a civil war in Algeria, very, very complex to go into, so I won't. But, this was a moment where, no one really understood where the enemy was. And so, like, everyone started to, protect themselves by installing, like, a second door, for example, in their building on top of the first door. And, in here we have, like, the wooden door and then the metal door that was added in the 90s. And collectively there's 9 locks on this door. And, it's kind of, I think, to kind of disable this threshold from being this, like, for, it kind of has been an object of fear for over a century, and to kind of like remove that and disable it from being able to perform that violence, I think was extremely important.
Yeah.
Could we maybe see some more pictures?
Yeah, maybe you want
sorry.
to show us some of the...
Yeah. But of course it was like, what was so intense and beautiful about this project was that, like, obviously I couldn't go back to Algiers, and so like I relied on like all of my close friends in Algeria to help me do that, like undertake this extremely like intense, labor intensive. But even just like, it was, I remember like the first person I called actually when I had this idea was one of my best friends there, Mimi, and she was like, I feel like you've died and you're asking me to deal with your stuff. And she was like, no one really has to do that unless someone's dead.
Yeah.
Like pack up their stuff, organize it, like protect it, decide what goes where. And, kind of like to ask them to do that was actually, yeah, one of the most intense parts of the work. And I think there was like so much that kind of care and negotiation that went into that. Not only because like we were undertaking this, like moving thousands of objects, but it was more just like, what does it mean to handle someone else's stuff? Like, we're actually at these. We should talk about these bugging devices. 'Cause they
Yeah.
are-
These are like the only objects that were like sculpted, right? Like
Yeah.
shaped.
And they were like placed in specific places throughout the show.
Yeah, so scattered throughout the show are these 5 bugging devices, which are kind of encased in these glass heads that I worked with a glass blower to blow. And the bugging devices work in 2 ways, so there's like 2 different systems in them. One of them is that each head has a telephone number, so you can call the heads and listen to whatever's happening around them. And then there's also another kind of ecosystem inside each head, which enables like, so if the viewer's in the space and they're making noises around these heads, then that would be echoed across the room. So it kind of gives the viewer this feeling that they're constantly being watched. And you know, in a way, like we don't install surveillance systems in the shows, and there's no, I mean, in Basel at least there was no invigilators. So like, this kind of became the only point of like surveillance, even though it's sonic, not like imagery. But no, I was really interested. I've been interested in surveillance for a very long time. The way like more just like the psychoactive position that surveillance tries to kind of get into, and the way that like the mind actually becomes that like where the surveillance like exists. Yeah, and I wonder like how much this acted as like a deterrent to people taking things, but I think it didn't. And there was another, I should quickly talk about this because it was really interesting to make. I got really interested in this form of surveillance that was developed by the Soviet Union, and it was basically like, how do you listen to a space that you can't access? And the way that you could do that is through light. So you basically turn the laser beam into a microphone, and you can convert like the vibrations of the laser on a window to pick up sound from the inside and transfer it into audible sound through the light. It's really complicated.
Very complicated.
But so we basically built, this is like an elemental microphone where like we have a laser beam coming from the front part of the building, shooting across the courtyard into a mirror, and then coming back into a receiver. So this brought in like a live element of sound. So like you could hear when it was snowing or raining, or like the wind was blowing or something cut through it. So it's this really beautiful kind of like soundtrack to the show, which was this like kind of live component that you would intersect when you cross the lasers in the space. It sounds mental, I know. Yeah.
I don't know if you want to mention anything else.
I don't know if we have not much time left.
Yeah.
So I don't know if you want to open up to questions or you want to show anything that.
I'm just going to keep going through.
Okay.
If you have any questions.
Should we open up if anyone has any questions? Anybody want to ask anything? A ver.
Hola. Like, hi. I didn't understand the last part, like that light laser. And I didn't go to the show, but what I like about the picture is like when you enter, you totally feel like a stranger. And that is a feeling that is constantly in our lives. So I like that it puts you in that violence of like human with intimacy. It's like you have that violence that you are entering a place and the people like don't want you to be there, and museums and that stuff has that power to, like, you are not so much, sometimes you don't feel that welcome in some places, and that's it.
Yeah, I think that was what was interesting about presenting a kind of domestic space and not giving instructions as to whether people could touch or not. And then kind of like watching people like, I think I was speaking about this yesterday with Alberto and Bea about, how even though the work is so kind of directly related to a context that is like specific to me, it's interesting how quickly that space became a mirror. Like, I was kind of had a lot of feedback from people after seeing the show saying that like it was there that they encountered like a moment in their life, or like the death of their grandfather where they had to like kind of go through this person's house, etc. And I think there were so many points of contact within the show, and so many like there was so much space, I think, and that was really important for me to kind of like to get over like the fear of people going through my stuff, and to be able to open that for people to encounter themselves through it. I think like I've been questioning a lot the concept of generosity, like what does it mean to give, and I think you can't give fully if you're in fear of losing yourself, So I think it's really important to, as a practice, it's very important for me as an artist to constantly be renegotiating the fear of loss in order to, do the work, basically. And I don't know if that answers your question.
Anyone else?
I was thinking because I was thinking of like that you created some sort of like a violent displacement, somehow like opening an interface, and then like creating this violent gesture, like going all the way to Basel, and somehow I was looking at this video and it's like she opened the portal somehow, like cutting the door, and like displacing it there, and then maybe it's very stupid, but I was thinking, if you actually close the portal of your interface in Algeria, because I was imagining the apartment being empty in Algeria, and how, and like and then I see this image, and my question is just like, if you close the portal of your displacement interface, or you just remain it open in Algeria.
If I close the portal, of
literally,
you mean that?
Yeah, in Algeria. Yeah.
Did I close it?
Yeah.
Yeah. We
Okay.
had to replace the door.
Yeah.
But no, someone else is living in there right now, actually. Like someone I was working with really closely needed somewhere to live. So I was like, well, you should just definitely move in.
No, I was thinking also like the seconds that this is like, like displaced. Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah. No, I mean that piece is extremely violent, and I'm still coming to terms with it. I think like also this project in many ways like became a mirror for myself, and like kind of I feel like maybe I have reenacted the violence that I felt by being dislocated from this place as a child, and I've done it to this door. It's kind of like it's been quite. It's funny because like in a lot of my previous work, it's always, there's like years of research or this really lengthy process of distilling something into this form that I like can have all the answers for. And with this project, it was just like this really like urgent feeling like I have to do this. And then I just like did it, and then now I'm still in the process of like understanding what it is. And it's like the work isn't even finished yet because it's still like being handled every single day right now. It's in Marseille. So people are like constantly, going through it. And then eventually after that show, it will go back to Algiers and I will travel back with it and reinstall the apartment as it was. And then I think at that point, I can maybe answer this question.
I mean, there's already like the healing, no? Like, if you replace it, it's already like somehow of like healing or carrying of that, that portal. Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, I
But it
don't know.
continues.
I mean, like, I'm also just like terrified of what's gonna happen when I like move everything back, and you know, it's like there's no such thing as like return.
Yeah.
You know, they've already gone through something else and they've changed, like on a kind of metaphysical level. They've been like seen and they've been like touched, and I think skin contact is like something you can't undo, you know. So yeah, I think that's going to be like another few years of distilling on that front. Oh, this is it in Marseille.
Thank you so much, Lydia, for sharing all of that. My question is a little bit dry, but like I'm thinking through like the process of ownership, because you've referred to these objects as your stuff, and
They're not actually.
right. It seems like they're actually someone.
Yeah.
Seems like many of these things are actually this other person's belongings that you somehow have come into your possession through this lease of this apartment, which I assume that you're still the leaseholder of it and will be until you return these things. So yeah, I don't know.
Where do they come from?
My question is, I think, like, how do you navigate that process of like ownership and belonging? Like, these are belongings, and you're thinking about belonging as a kind of like to places, and yeah, is there like an ethical kind of impulse or like necessity to inform the next tenant of this apartment that where these objects have been?
Yeah. Do you know what? I actually have never thought about who's going to live there next, which is crazy. But no, I didn't mention that. You know that when the house was fully furnished, it belonged to the aunt of my landlady, and actually she had a really interesting, situation where she was married to a man in Germany, and so this was the household that they shared together in Germany. That when they divorced, she got to keep and move back to Algeria. So it's kind of this like, it's done this loop in a weird way, like, and it's interesting like especially when it was in Basel, when people walked into that space, they were like, this looks like my grandmother's house, and like there was kind of German books on the shelf and like stickers from like where these pieces of furniture were from in Germany. And I think that was really important also in like kind of thinking about like the hauntology of space and how like objects can carry, I was thinking about this woman, for example, divorcing her husband, moving all of this back to Algeria, and then like continuing to live amongst like all of these things that she shared in her previous marriage, and like that creating this disability for her to move on, and I think objects have this power over you when they are so interconnected with a time and space. I don't know if, like, I wonder if somewhere there is an element of resolve. I can't really claim that for them. But I actually, of course I will tell the next person who moves in where they've been. No, but the one condition of my landlady allowing me to borrow all of these objects was that she wanted me to make her like a souvenir book, which I will do, kind of like so that she could show her family like what happened and all of that. So yeah, I'm currently working on a book.
That's fascinating. Thank you.
Okay.
I think we should
Should we leave it
wrap
here?
up.
Yeah.
Thank
Okay,
you
thank you so much, Lydia, for this.